going to ask and hopefully answer the question of what exactly is a ben Noach? What does that term mean? Can we arrive at a technical definition of that term? It's a halachic concept, and someone who is defined as a ben Noach has very specific obligations to fulfill, as well as a moral and ethical life to lead, as defined in both biblical and rabbinic sources. And when we speak of halachic concepts, we are primarily interested in measurements, not poetry. Chazal have carried the Masorah of Ben Noach, the rabbinic tradition about the concept of Noahides, and have outlined the laws and their application. And by the way, as I've mentioned, the term Chazal is an acronym for Chachmeinu Zichronam Livracha, our sages of blessed memory, the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Gemara. And a Ben Noach has every reason to use this term, because the guidelines for fulfilling the 7 mitzvot and living a Noahide life comes to them courtesy of the Torah that was given to Moses and to all those who are essentially his disciples through received tradition, from Joshua through the Amoraim and on through the generations. So that's a term that you can feel free to use, Chazal. And what does this term Ben Noach mean? Is it an ethnic designation? Is it a description of a person's relation to Hashem, to Torah? What does it have to do with Noach? Why is it different than the term Yisrael or Bnei Yisrael? So first, let's deal with the question of to whom does the term Ben Noach apply? Our first source comes from a Mishnah in Tractate Nidarim. This tractate deals with an important concept in Jewish law. There's several types of oaths that one can make, and all of them create legal realities for the one who makes the oath. One way to distinguish between types of oaths is to understand their effect, in what way the oath binds and obligates the one who makes it. With a neder, a person establishes the relationship between a certain item and himself. For example, he can take a permitted item and make it forbidden to himself. And this is something that people do when they commit themselves to not smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol. The cigarette is not a forbidden item, nor is the glass of wine, although it's hard to understand, frankly, why cigarettes are permitted, given what the research says about them. But if a person makes a neder that these things are forbidden to him, it becomes an actual transgression for him to smoke or drink. And in order to release himself from the neder, he needs to undergo a legal process that's called hatarat nedarim. Otherwise, it's binding indefinitely. Hatarat nedarim is customarily performed before Rosh Hashanah in order to release a person from legally binding oaths, especially ones that he's forgotten about. But people do this. There are people who actually do hatarat nedarim every single week before Shabbat. And the concept of hatarat nedarim, okay, to illustrate the idea, the Mishnah gives an example. If a person says konan, which is a word that indicates a neder, and continues by saying, I will not derive benefit from the property of Bnei Noach. He may derive benefit from the property of Bnei Israel, but is forbidden to derive benefit from the property of the nations of the world. It's not to say that the property or the belongings of Bnei Noach are forbidden in and of themselves, but that the individual who has made the neder may not make use of them. Now, why would a person do this? Is the Mishnah suggesting some sort of xenophobic practice, like anti-Bnei Noach practice? Not at all. The case, like so many other cases, is simply brought to illustrate the technical implications of language. If you understood the language of the Mishnah, you now know that there is a halachic distinction between Bnei Noach and Bnei Israel, so that if a person uses the term Bnei Noach, he is not referring to Jews. Now, of course, you know that already, but it's helpful to see it in sources. However, let's look at source 2. As Rashi points out, this type of neder can be very far-reaching. As he says, quote, the entire world's population is descended from the offspring of Noach. Now, we know from the Mishnah that the term Bnei Noach does not include Bnei Israel. But from Rashi's expression, we can ask the question, if the whole world descends from the offspring of Noach, at what point did Bnei Israel become a distinct subgroup within the total population? So Rabbeinu Nisim of Girondi, who is usually referred to by his acronym RAN or Haran, was a Rishon from the 14th century Spain. And if you look in source 3, we'll see his commentary on the Gemara. He notes that from the time that Abraham sanctified himself, the Jews are named for him and not for Noach. And the Rosh in source 5 also says this. Now, the Jews are, or at least were, Bnei Noach. But the direct descendants of Abraham are in a category of their own. There is an entire universe to be understood by the simple phrase, Abraham sanctified himself. And that is beyond the scope of this lecture. And Amir Tzashem, we will address it at some point. It's a very, very deep idea, the difference between Bnei Noach and Bnei Israel. For now, though, let's simply understand that Abraham was known as Abraham HaIvri. The word Ivri means one who crosses over. Abraham came to the land of Canaan from across the Jordan River, so he was known as Abraham HaIvri. The word Ivri is also the root of the word Hebrew, Ivrit. Now, on a deeper level, it's like saying that Abraham stood on one side of a river while the rest of the world stood on the other side. He was completely different from everyone because of his faith in one God. When the Ran says Abraham sanctified himself, he uses the word itkadesh. Now, the word itkadesh means sanctified himself. It has the root kuf dalid shin, which is the same root as the word kedusha. Kedusha means holiness. You're probably familiar with that word. Likadesh literally means to separate from or to designate. Abraham separated himself from the rest of the world. It didn't matter what was happening in society. Abraham stepped away. He resisted. A human being knows that he's needed in the world because he's unique. He has his own unique mission. And if there's anybody who was able to recognize that in himself, it was Abraham. And we see from the life of Abraham that he led a moral and spiritual existence that was unique in the world. Perhaps the Ran is only referring to the circumcision. What did it mean that he sanctified himself? Which specific event is he talking about? Or is he talking about a more general description of Abraham, who sanctified himself with his life? But what we know is that Abraham was like a tree, the likes of which had not been planted since Noach, 10 generations earlier. And his descendants are like the branches of that tree that was started at that time. Now, if we look in the continuation of the Mishnah, this is source number 4. Quote, I will not derive benefit from the property of the offspring of Abraham. That person is forbidden to derive benefit from a property belonging to Bnei Israel and is permitted to derive benefit from property belonging to any of the other nations of the world. We are introduced here to the term Zera Abraham, the offspring of Abraham. And it only applies to Bnei Israel. Now that should raise some questions, since as we know, Abraham had other offspring, at least 7, if not 8 children besides Isaac. And we'll come back to that. While the Mishnah says Zera Abraham only applies to Bnei Israel, the Rambam in source number 6, flips that around and says that the term Bnei Noach only applies to the nations of the world. We're looking at the converse. And that's a very interesting way of phrasing it, since they only make up 99.99999% of the world's population. Moving from the Rishonim into the Poskim, the Arbiturim is the precursor to the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law. It was written by Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher, the son of Rabbeinu Asher, who was the Rosh, another Rishon who I quoted earlier. The family originated in Cologne, Germany, which was at that time part of the Holy Roman Empire. But due to persecution, the family moved to the city of Toledo in Spain. So we have this very interesting, a rabbinic family that is essential to the development of the Ashkenazi tradition that becomes a foundation of the Spanish Jewish culture by their emigration into Spain. The Tur, as he's known, organized Jewish law into 4 sections, which is why his sefer is called Arbiturim. It's a reference to the rows of gems on the high priest's breastplate. And this format was emulated by the Shulchan Aruch, which also has 4 sections, and that has become a standard. The Tur in source number 7 quotes the Mishnah in Nedarim, and then makes a very interesting point about the term Zera Avraham. He says, quote, if he made an oath forbidding himself from deriving benefit from Zera Avraham, the seed of Abraham, he is forbidden to derive benefit from Jews and converts to Judaism, but is permitted to derive benefit from the descendants of Ishmael and Esau. Now, let's divide this into 2 parts. First, please make note that the Tur defines Zera Avraham as a term that includes both Jews from birth and converts to Judaism. When Hashem changed the name Avram to Avraham, he said that Abraham would be Av Hamon Goyim, the father of many nations. And converts refer to themselves as Ben or Bat Avraham. Avraham is their father to the extent that when we say Zera Avraham, his offspring, we include converts, people who are not genetically linked to Abraham. Second, the Tur notes that if a person forbids himself from deriving benefit from the property of Zera Avraham, he is still permitted to derive benefit from the descendants of Ishmael and Esau. On the one hand, converts to Judaism who are not genetically linked to Abraham are considered his offspring. On the other hand, the descendants of Ishmael and Esau, the son and grandson of Abraham, who are genetically linked to Abraham, are not considered his offspring. They are Bnei Noach. How can this be? Sources 8, 9, and 10 are Rashi's commentary on a sugya in the tractate of Avodah Zarah. We have 3 examples of biblical personalities, 2 of the forefathers and 1 of the sons of Jacob. Exhibit A, Abraham. Rashi says Nimrod threw Abraham, our father, into a furnace in Kasdim because he did not accept upon himself the obligation to worship idols. Why? It was forbidden to Bnei Noach, and Abraham was a Ben Noach. Now think about this. There are 2 people mentioned here, Nimrod and Abraham. Rashi mentioned that Abraham was a Ben Noach, but he did not mention that Nimrod was also technically a Ben Noach. What is the difference between the 2 of them? What's the difference between Abraham and Nimrod on this point? Both Nimrod and Abraham, as Bnei Noach, were commanded not to worship idols. In fact, true, Abraham was unique. He was a maverick. He went against the grain of the entire society with his beliefs and actions. But everything that Abraham stood for was something that had already been commanded of the entire human race. What made Abraham different is that he cared. Exhibit B, Jacob. After 20 years of life with Lavan, Jacob runs away with his wives, his children, his sheep, his wealth, all of which were earned fair and square. Lavan, who was always on the take, catches up to them and begins searching their tents to see if he can find any of his own personal property, his idols. Jacob says to him, "What have you found from any of the utensils of your house?" He was angry at him. According to Rashi, this is kind of a strange question. After all, can you imagine living in someone else's house for 20 years? And when you leave, not one of their possessions, not even a Q-tip, ends up in your suitcase by accident? Yet, quote, Bnei Noach had been commanded concerning theft, and Jacob fulfilled this commandment, end quote. Let me remind us that there are two Bnei Noach in this exchange. Lavan was also a Ben Noach, but it was Jacob who fulfilled the commandment prohibiting theft. Lavan, as we know, had no problem with theft. And now Exhibit C, Joseph. Joseph was someone who was placed in a very compromising position with the wife of Potiphar. Yet, as the Gemara states, he was not suspected of the transgression. What's the transgression? It's the transgression of Eshet Ish, sexual relations with another person's wife. Where is such a prohibition written? The verse in Genesis says that, quote, a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife. And in the Gemara, in Sanhedrin, we learn by inference his wife and not someone else's wife. That's the source of the prohibition for Bnei Noach. And Joseph was a Ben Noach who fulfilled this commandment. The wife of Potiphar was a Bat Noach as much as Joseph was a Ben Noach. Yet Joseph was the one who cared. So to summarize, all human beings were, before the giving of the Torah, Bnei Noach. Even the forefathers and the foremothers of the Jewish people, who from the time of Abraham's commitment to a life of Kedusha were a recognizable and distinct group, but they were still Bnei Noach. All of the distinct personalities of the book of Genesis, in fact, whether they're good or evil, are people who are in some form of relationship to the Noahide laws, whether they upheld them or they transgressed them. But the tzaddikim, the people that we are supposed to emulate, were all people who believed in Hashem and kept the 7 mitzvot. So, to answer the question, why are Ishmael and Esav not considered Zerah Abraham? Why do they have the status of Bnei Noach? The answer is that it's not enough to be genetically linked to Abraham. You have to be a student of Abraham. You have to be a disciple. You have to follow his path and emulate his character. And the cultures and civilizations that descend from Ishmael and Esav stopped doing this a long time ago. So today, they are not considered to be Zerah Abraham. But similarly, a Ben Noach, if we're going to really drill down, is somebody who emulates Noach. And we know that Noach walked with God. So what's interesting here is that we have several ways to understand the term Ben Noach. The first is simply a non-Jew. And that's a result of ancestry and genetics. This type of person is not necessarily Torah observant with regard to the Sheva Mitzvot. They're not necessarily a believer in Hashem, or necessarily an ethical human being for that matter. The second type of person, who we call a Ben Noach, is Torah observant, believes in Hashem, and keeps the Sheva Mitzvot. And this is a category of righteous people, part of the fraternity of ethical mankind, although they're not part of the Jewish community. And the third category of Bnei Noach is a person who has approached a Beit Din, a rabbinical court of 3 judges, and officially obligates him or herself to believe in Hashem and to keep the Noahide laws. That person is also a Ben or Bat Noach, who has the status of Ger Toshav, a resident. Specifically, when we say a resident, a Ger Toshav is somebody who lives or can live in the land of Israel at such a time when we have a temple and a Sanhedrin that's intact. This is a Ben Noach who is part of the Jewish community, a person who is invited to live in and be part of Jewish communities, particularly Eretz Israel, and they can be supported by Jewish charities, and so on. They are part of the family. And this is something that distinguishes Judaism from other religions, maybe all other religions. People can become part of the fabric of Jewish society without the demand for conversion. It's a very innovative position to take. It's important to understand that the idea of a Ben Noach is not some form of apologetic. It's not a feel-good idea meant to placate non-Jews. It's a real status within Jewish law. It's not as if Hashem only loves the Jewish people or only has a place for Jewish people in the covenantal civilization that he wants to create in this world. If we look at the Midrash Halacha in source number 12, it's really an incredible thing. Let's look at it inside, actually. It is written, Hashem loves the righteous. Thus says the Holy One, blessed be He, I love those who love me. And similarly, the verse states, I will honor those who honor me. They love me, and I also love them. Why does the Holy One, blessed be He, love the righteous? Because righteousness is not an inheritance. And by the way, the term righteous doesn't have an ethnic designation, doesn't apply to a specific group of people. Righteousness is not an inheritance or a family trait. You find that Kohanim are priests because of their families, that the Leviim are Levites because of their families, as the verse states, O house of Aaron, bless Hashem. O house of Levi, bless Hashem. Now, if someone wanted to become a priest, he could not. Now, we have a hierarchy. In Klal Yisrael, we have a hierarchy. We have Cohen, Levi, and Yisrael. And there's no mobility between these groups, unless, let's say, there's a marriage between them. That the status of Cohen, Levi, and Yisrael is determined by the father. Jewishness is actually determined by the mother. But the particular designation as a Jew is determined by the father. L'mishpachotam, l'veit avotam, things follow the father's household. So if you have a marriage, let's say, between a Kohen and a woman from the category of Yisrael, the offspring become Kohanim. But if an individual wants to discover some form of upward mobility, wants to go from Yisrael to Levi, wants to go from Levi to Kohen, that's not possible just on the basis of individual decision. And it's not based on how good you are or how nice you are. It's just based on your family background. If someone wanted to become a priest, he could not. To become a Levite, he could not. Why? Because his father is not a priest or a Levite. But if he desires to become a tzaddik, a righteous person, even a non-Jew can do this. Because it's not a family trait. Therefore, the verse states, "Oh, this is the end of that train. meaning we said that O house of Aaron, bless Hashem. O house of Lady, bless Hashem. The final category is, oh, you who fear Hashem, bless Hashem. It doesn't say the house of those who fear Hashem. Right? It doesn't say the house of those who fear Hashem, which would indicate like some sort of family inheritance. It simply says those who fear Hashem. It's not a family trait. Rather, we're talking about people here who chose to love Hashem, and therefore Hashem loves them. This is something that is open literally to everybody. Now, I don't know if you have in your source sheets a number 13. If not, oh, you do, okay. So there you see an amazing series of statements by Rabbi Yirmiyah showing example after example how universal the message is. That this is a Torah for humanity, that the righteous can enter, that the faithful can come in, that tzaddikim can sing to Hashem, and that Hashem should do good for good people. He's quoting verse after verse and explaining to us that these verses do not say Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. They say tzaddikim. They say tovim, good people. They say shomer emunim, people who keep faith. So they're universal. Being a righteous person, a good person, someone who loves and fears Hashem is a possibility for all mankind. It's Torat Adam. We've seen that source a number of times already. We saw it in I think both of the shiurim on Torah study and on Shabbat observance. Over there, the Gemara said that how do we know that a non-Jew who studies Torah is like the high priest? Because it says Asher. I'm not supposed to quote verses from Torah from memory, but there it says that through which a man shall do them and live. Okay, for a person lives through the mitzvot, and over there in the verse it says Adam. It says a person lives through their mitzvah observance. It doesn't say Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael. It doesn't specify Jews. It says man, indicating that the Torah and its mitzvot are applicable to all mankind. It's not a family trait. Hashem especially loves those people who choose to do this because it's a choice that people make as responsible, conscious individuals out of their own free will. And as the Rambam writes in the last source, based on the Tosefta and in the Gemara and Sanhedrin, the righteous amongst the nations of the world have a share in the world to come. And I give us all a blessing to have the strength to persevere. With Torah, we know that we're on the right path, and we should all merit the sweetness of Olam Haba and the world to come.